Marcus Rodriguez had exactly $12 in his wallet when he knocked on Eleanor Hartwell's door that cold December morning. The old woman stood barely 5 feet tall, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun, watching through the crack in her door as this stranger offered to fix her broken fence for nothing more than a hot meal. What Marcus didn't know was that Eleanor had been watching him for weeks, had seen him walking past her property each morning on his way to find work, had noticed how he always picked up the trash that blew into her bees' yard without being asked. He didn't know that behind her modest wooden house sat 200 acres of prime farmland, or that she had no living relatives, or that she'd been praying for someone, anyone, to show her that kindness still existed in the world. But as Eleanor opened that door wider and invited him in for coffee, one question lingered in the crisp winter air. Could a simple act of compassion between two strangers change both their lives forever? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street as Marcus Rodriguez shouldered his worn tool bag and began another day of searching for work. His calloused hands, scarred from years of carpentry, gripped the handles of his toolbox with the quiet desperation of a man who knew his 8-year-old daughter Emma needed new school clothes, and their small apartment's rent was already 3 days overdue. The December air bit through his faded flannel shirt, but Marcus had long since learned to ignore discomfort when survival was on the line. Millbrook wasn't the kind of place that offered much opportunity for a carpenter without connections. The wealthy families who lived in the historic district hired established contractors for their renovations, while the working-class neighborhoods like his own barely had money for basic repairs. Marcus had been walking these same streets for 2 weeks now, knocking on doors, leaving his business card at hardware stores, and checking the community bulletin board at Peterson's grocery for any odd jobs that might help him scrape together enough money to keep his small family afloat. His wife Sarah had died in a car accident 18 months ago, leaving him to raise Emma alone while battling the crushing weight of medical bills and funeral expenses that had wiped out their savings. The insurance settlement had helped for a while, but medical debt had a way of consuming everything. And Marcus had discovered that being a single father meant choosing between taking care of his daughter and pursuing the kind of steady work that required him to be away for long hours. Most days he chose Emma, and most days they got by on mac and cheese and the fierce determination that had carried him through 2 tours in Afghanistan before he'd learned to build instead of destroy. As he walked down Elm Street, Marcus noticed the same broken fence he'd been passing for weeks. The white picket barrier around the old Hartwell place had several missing boards, and the gate hung crooked on rusted hinges that squeaked in the morning breeze. The house itself was small and neat, painted a faded yellow with green shutters, surrounded by what must have been a beautiful garden in warmer months. Now, in December, the flower beds were dormant, covered with a layer of brown leaves that rustled when the wind stirred them. Marcus had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home until he'd aged out of the system at 18 and enlisted in the Army. He'd learned early that most people didn't have time for other people's problems, that kindness was a luxury most couldn't afford. But something about the broken fence bothered him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the obvious pride the homeowner took in the rest of the property, or maybe it was the way the damaged boards stuck out like broken teeth in an otherwise welcoming smile. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself slowing his pace each morning as he passed, studying the damage and mentally calculating what it would take to fix it properly. The fence wasn't just broken. It was crying out for attention in the way that only neglected things could. 3 boards were missing entirely, probably blown away during the fierce windstorm they'd had 2 weeks ago. The remaining pickets were weathered and gray, their white paint peeling like old skin, and the posts had begun to lean at odd angles where the ground had shifted over time. It was the kind of repair job that would take a full day to do right, maybe 2 if you wanted to paint it properly, and Marcus estimated it would cost at least $200 in materials alone. On this particular morning, as he paused to study the fence more carefully, Marcus noticed an elderly woman watching him from her kitchen window. She was small and slight, with silver hair that caught the morning light, and she held a coffee mug in both hands as if warming herself against the December chill. When their eyes met through the glass, she didn't look away or duck behind the curtains the way some people did when caught staring. Instead, she raised her mug slightly in a small gesture that might have been a greeting, and Marcus found himself lifting his hand in response. The woman disappeared from the window, and Marcus was about to continue his walk when the front door opened. She stepped onto the small covered porch, still holding her coffee, and regarded him with curious blue eyes that seemed to take in everything from his worn work boots to the tool bag slung over his shoulder. "You've been walking past here every morning for weeks," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of age, but with an underlying strength that suggested she wasn't as fragile as she appeared. "Always slow down when you see my fence." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed to be caught in what might look like casing the property. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I'm Marcus Rodriguez. I do carpentry work, and I guess I have a hard time walking past things that need fixing without thinking about how I'd go about it." The woman studied him for a long moment, taking in his honest expression and the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, like a man more comfortable working with his hands than making conversation with strangers. "Eleanor Hartwell," she said finally, "and you're thinking my fence is an eyesore." "No, ma'am, not at all," Marcus said quickly. "Your place is beautiful. The fence just looks like it took a beating in that storm we had, and I imagine it's frustrating not being able to get it fixed right away. Good contractors are hard to find, and the ones you can find charge premium prices." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "You sound like you know something about that problem." Marcus let out a rueful laugh. "More than I'd like to. I've been looking for work for a couple of weeks now. Turns out being new in town without a lot of references makes it hard to compete with the established guys." "Where are you from originally?" "Military family. Moved around a lot growing up. Spent some time overseas with the Army, then settled in Colorado for a few years with my wife. We moved here about 2 years ago because Sarah, my wife, she had family in the area. Thought it would be good for our daughter to have that connection." Marcus paused, the familiar tightness settling in his chest when he talked about Sarah. Things didn't work out the way we planned. Eleanor's expression softened, and Marcus realized she'd heard something in his voice that he hadn't meant to reveal. There was a quality to her attention that made him feel like she was actually listening, not just waiting for him to finish talking so she could get back to her morning routine. "Tell me something, Marcus Rodriguez," Eleanor said, settling more comfortably against her porch railing. "If you were going to fix my fence, how would you go about it?" The question surprised him, but Marcus found himself answering automatically, his mind shifting into the practical mode that always calmed him when life felt overwhelming. "Well, first thing I'd do is pull out those loose posts and dig them out properly. The ground's shifted, probably from all the rain we had in October, so they need to be reset with fresh concrete. Then I'd measure for replacement boards, make sure to match the height and spacing of the existing pickets. The gate needs new hardware. Those hinges are shot, and honestly, the whole thing could use a good sanding and fresh coat of paint if you wanted it to look like new." "How long would a job like that take?" "Done right? 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather doesn't cooperate. 1 day for the structural work, another for the finish, carpentry, and painting." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And what would something like that cost?" Marcus did quick calculations in his head, thinking about material costs and what his time was worth versus what he desperately needed to earn. Materials alone would run about $200. Maybe $250 if you wanted premium lumber and good quality hardware. Labor would depend on who you hired. but most contractors around here would probably charge $400 to $600 for a job like this." "That's a lot of money." "Yes, ma'am, it is." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, studying Marcus with those sharp blue eyes. "What if I told you I couldn't afford to pay someone $600 to fix my fence?" Marcus felt a familiar stab of sympathy. He'd met plenty of people, especially elderly folks on fixed incomes, who had to choose between necessary repairs and other expenses like groceries or medication. "I'd tell you that sometimes you can get by with temporary fixes until you save up enough to do it right. A few boards from the hardware store, some basic hardware to stabilize the gate. It wouldn't look perfect, but it would be functional." "And if I told you I couldn't afford even that?" The question hung in the air between them, and Marcus realized this conversation had become something more than casual small talk. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't just asking hypothetical questions about fence repair. She was testing him, though he couldn't quite understand what the test was supposed to reveal. "I guess I'd ask if you had any materials lying around that we could use," Marcus said slowly. "Sometimes people have leftover lumber in garages or basements from old projects. And I'd suggest doing the work in stages, fixing the most urgent problems first, and tackling the rest as money became available." "And if I told you I had no materials and no money?" Marcus looked at the fence again, then back at Eleanor's weathered face. Something about her expression told him this wasn't entirely theoretical. That behind the neat appearance of the house and yard, Eleanor Hartwell might be struggling financially in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He thought about Emma, about the nights when she asked if they were poor and he had to figure out how to be honest without scaring her, about the choice between buying groceries and putting gas in the truck. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "if you're telling me you can't afford to fix your fence and it's something that's bothering you or making you feel unsafe, I'd probably offer to take a look at it and see what could be done with what you have on hand. Maybe we could find a solution that doesn't cost much money." Eleanor's eyes brightened, and for the first time since she'd stepped onto the porch, she smiled. It was a small smile, but it transformed her face entirely, revealing a warmth that had been hidden behind her cautious expression. "That's very kind of you to offer," she said, "but I couldn't ask you to work for free. Everyone deserves to be paid for their labor." "You're not asking," Marcus pointed out. "I'm offering. And sometimes, when people help each other out, it doesn't have to be about money. Maybe you have something else to trade, or maybe someday when I need a favor, you'll remember this conversation." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing something in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "I don't have money to pay you for the work," she said, "but I do make excellent coffee, and I usually cook too much food for one person. If you were willing to fix my fence in exchange for meals while you work, I'd consider that a fair trade." Marcus felt a strange stirring in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in months. Not just relief at the prospect of free meals, though that was certainly part of it, but something deeper. The recognition that this small, silver-haired woman was offering him something more valuable than money. Dignity. She wasn't asking him to work for charity or accepting his help with the kind of grudging embarrassment he'd seen in other people's faces. She was proposing a trade, an exchange of value that allowed both of them to maintain their self-respect. "That sounds like a fair deal to me," Marcus said. "When would you want me to start?" "No time like the present, if you don't have other commitments today." Marcus thought about the job applications he'd planned to fill out, the construction sites where he'd hoped to catch foremen in good moods, the endless cycle of looking for work that had consumed his life for the past 2 weeks. None of it seemed as important as the opportunity standing in front of him. "Let me just call my daughter's school and let them know where I'll be in case they need to reach me," he said. "Then I can take a look at what we're working with." Eleanor's smile widened. "I'll put on a fresh pot of coffee." As Eleanor disappeared into the house, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed Emma's school. He reached the main office and explained that he'd be working at a local address if they needed to contact him, gave them Eleanor's house number that he could see painted on the mailbox, and promised to pick Emma up at the counter. Usual time. It was a routine he'd developed since becoming a single parent, making sure someone always knew where he was and how to reach him, because Emma had already lost one parent and couldn't afford to worry about losing another. When he finished the call, Marcus walked around the fence, examining it more closely than he'd been able to from the sidewalk. Up close, the damage was more extensive than he'd initially thought. The storm had done more than just knock out a few boards. It had twisted the entire structure, pulling some posts partially out of the ground and creating stress fractures in several others. The gate wasn't just crooked, it was completely unusable, held closed only by a piece of wire that Eleanor had apparently wrapped around the post to keep it from swinging open. But as Marcus studied the fence more carefully, he began to see solutions. The posts could be straightened and reinforced rather than completely replaced. Some of the damaged boards could be salvaged if he was creative about cutting around the broken sections. The gate would need new hardware, but the frame itself was solid. It would require more creativity than money, and creativity was something Marcus had in abundance. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a small plate of what looked like homemade cookies. She'd put on a worn cardigan over her blouse and exchanged her slippers for practical work boots that had clearly seen plenty of use. "I thought you might like some fortification before you get started," she said, offering him one of the mugs. "And I brought cookies. Oatmeal raisin. Made them yesterday." The coffee was perfect, strong and hot, with just a hint of cinnamon that warmed him from the inside out. The cookies were even better, with the kind of genuine homemade taste that reminded Marcus of the few good foster homes he'd lived in as a child, places where someone had cared enough to bake from scratch. "This is wonderful," he said, meaning it. "Thank you. It's nothing special. I enjoy baking, but it's not much fun when you're only cooking for one person." As they stood together drinking coffee and sharing cookies, Marcus found himself studying Eleanor more closely. She was probably in her 70s, with a kind of erect posture and alert expression that suggested she was still sharp and capable despite her age. Her clothes were simple but well-maintained, and her hands, wrapped around the coffee mug, showed the calluses and stains of someone who spent time gardening and working with her hands. "Have you lived here long?" Marcus asked. 63 years, Eleanor replied. "My husband bought this place right after we were married. 5 acres, though it seemed like a mansion to us at the time. We were both from farming families, thought we'd raise our own food and maybe have some animals." "Did you? Farm, I mean?" Eleanor's expression grew distant. "For a while. We had a big garden, some chickens, even a couple of goats one year that turned out to be more trouble than they were worth. Richard, my husband, he had dreams of turning this into a real working farm, but life—" "Had other plans?" "What kind of other plans?" "The kind that happen when you can't have children and you spend every spare dollar on doctors and treatments that don't work," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "By the time we accepted that it wasn't going to happen for us, we were too old and too tired to start over with farming. Richard got a job at the lumber mill. I worked at the school cafeteria, and we just maintained cashier." "What we had." Marcus heard something in her voice, a careful neutrality that suggested decades of practice in talking about disappointment without letting it overwhelm her. He recognized it because he'd been developing the same skill since Sarah's death, the ability to acknowledge loss without being consumed by it. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Don't be. We had a good life together, Richard and I. 45 years before the cancer took him. Some people never get that." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Eleanor collected the empty mugs and headed back toward the house. "I'll let you get to work," she said. "Call out if you need anything, or if you want more coffee. I'll start thinking about lunch." Marcus set down his toolbox and began the methodical process of assessing the fence damage. He pulled out each loose board, examining it for salvageable sections, and setting aside pieces that were beyond repair. The posts required more investigation. He used a small shovel to dig around the bases, testing their stability and checking the condition of the concrete footings. As he worked, his mind settled into the familiar rhythm of problem-solving that had always calmed him. Each challenge had a solution. Each broken piece could be repaired or replaced, and every problem could be broken down into manageable steps. It was the kind of work that made sense in a way that the rest of his life often didn't, where effort and skill produced visible, measurable results. By mid-morning, Marcus had a clear picture of what needed to be done and what materials he'd need to complete the job properly. The damage was extensive enough that a temporary patch job wouldn't be sufficient. The fence needed structural repairs that would require lumber, hardware, and concrete. He'd been optimistic about working with salvaged materials, but reality had a way of crushing optimism when it came to construction projects. Eleanor appeared at his elbow as if she'd been reading his thoughts. "It's worse than it looked from a distance, isn't it?" "I'm afraid so," Marcus admitted. "I can make it functional with what's here, but it won't be pretty, and it probably won't last through another serious storm. What would it take to do it right?" Marcus pulled a small notebook from his pocket and showed her the list he'd been making. About 8 replacement boards, 2 bags of concrete mix, new gate hardware, sandpaper, primer, and paint. Maybe $150 in materials, assuming I can find everything at the discount building. Supply place out on Route 9. Eleanor studied the list, her face unreadable. "That's less than you estimated earlier. I'm being more creative about what can be salvaged and what really needs to be replaced. And I'm not charging myself for labor." "Marcus," Eleanor said quietly, "I need to be honest with you about something." Something in her tone made Marcus look up from his notebook. Eleanor's expression had grown serious, almost troubled, and she seemed to be struggling with some internal decision. "When I said I couldn't afford to pay someone to fix my fence, I wasn't being entirely truthful," she continued. "I can afford the materials. I was testing you, to see what kind of person you are when you think someone can't pay you." Marcus felt a flash of confusion, followed by something that might have been hurt. "I don't understand. I'd been watching you walk past here for weeks," Eleanor said. "Every morning, you slow down and look at my fence like it personally offends you. But you also pick up the trash that blows into my yard. And last week when my newspaper landed in the bushes, you put it on my porch step without being asked. I wanted to know if you were the kind of man who would help someone even when there was nothing in it for you. And now you know? Now I know." Eleanor reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small roll of bills. "This should cover the materials and then some. I want you to fix my fence properly, Marcus Rodriguez, and I want to pay you fairly for your work." Marcus stared at the money, feeling a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. Relief that he'd be paid for his labor ward with embarrassment that he'd been tested without knowing it, and underneath both was a growing curiosity about Eleanor Hartwell and why his character had mattered so much to her. "Why?" he asked finally. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out across her yard toward the road where other people were going about their morning routines, unaware of the small drama playing out behind the broken fence. "Because in 63 years of living in this house," she said finally, "you're the first person who offered to help me with something without being asked, without expecting payment, and without making me feel like a charity case. That tells me something about who you are, and I'd like to know more." The simple honesty of her answer hit Marcus harder than any compliment he'd ever received. He thought about all the times he'd walked past people who needed help, all the moments when he'd been too busy or too worried about his own problems to notice someone else's struggles. The fact that this one small gesture had meant so much to Eleanor made him realize how rare genuine kindness had become, how unusual it was for people to help each other without calculating the personal cost. "Keep your money for now," Marcus said, handing the bills back to her. "Let me finish the job first, then we'll talk about payment. I want to make sure you're satisfied with the work before we settle up." Eleanor smiled and tucked the money back into her pocket. "In that case, I'd better go start lunch. All this honesty has made me hungry." As Eleanor headed back toward the house, Marcus found himself working with renewed energy. The fence posts that had seemed hopelessly crooked an hour ago now looked like manageable challenges, and the list of needed materials had transformed from an insurmountable expense into a reasonable investment in a bond. Job well done. He spent the rest of the morning carefully removing damaged boards and stabilizing the posts that could be saved. The work was methodical and satisfying, each small repair bringing the fence closer to functional beauty. As he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about Eleanor's test and what it revealed about both of them. She was a woman who had learned to be careful about trust, who needed to know something about a person's character before letting them into her life in even a small way. He was a man who had been raised to help when he could, even when helping didn't benefit him directly. The smell of something delicious drifted from the house around noon, and Marcus realized he was genuinely hungry for the first time in weeks. The constant stress of unemployment had killed his appetite, leaving him eating only when necessary and taking no pleasure in food. But the morning of physical work and the promise of Eleanor's cooking had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death. When Eleanor called him in for lunch, Marcus was surprised to find the kitchen table set for two with what was obviously the good china. The meal itself is simple but perfect: homemade vegetable soup, fresh bread, and a salad made with late-season greens from Eleanor's garden. But it was the care that had gone into the presentation, the cloth napkins and the small vase of dried flowers from the garden, that made Marcus realize this was more than just feeding the hired help. "This is beautiful," Marcus said, settling into the chair Eleanor indicated. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble." "It's not trouble when you have someone to share it with," Eleanor replied, ladling soup into his bowl. "I haven't had a proper lunch companion in months." The soup was the best thing Marcus had tasted in longer than he could remember. Rich and warming with flavors that spoke of vegetables grown with care and seasoned with experience. As they ate, Eleanor asked about his daughter, his plans for the future, and his thoughts about living in Millbrook. Her questions were gentle but probing, the kind that revealed she was genuinely interested in his answers rather than just making conversation. Marcus found himself talking more freely than he had since Sarah's death, sharing stories about Emma's precocious intelligence and stubborn independence, his struggles with single parenthood, and his hopes for building utopia. Stable life in their new town. Eleanor listened with the kind of focused attention that made him feel like his words mattered, that his experiences were worth hearing about. "Emma sounds like a remarkable child," Eleanor said when Marcus finished describing his daughter's latest school project about local history. "You must be very proud of her." "I am," Marcus said simply. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing right by her, raising her alone, but she's resilient and smart and kind. If I can just keep us stable until she's grown, I think she'll be fine." "Stability is important," Eleanor agreed. "But so is knowing that the people who love you will do whatever it takes to take care of you. Emma knows that about you, I'm sure." After lunch, Marcus returned to the fence with a full stomach and a lightened heart. The afternoon passed quickly as he prepared the damaged posts for reinforcement and made detailed measurements for the replacement boards he'd need to buy. Eleanor appeared periodically with glasses of water or iced tea, sometimes stopping to chat about the work or the weather, sometimes just observing his progress with quiet approval. Around 3 o'clock, Marcus realized he needed to leave to pick up Emma from school. He'd made good progress on the preliminary work, but the fence was still in pieces, looking worse than when he'd started because of all the damaged materials he'd removed. "I'll stop by the building supply place on my way home and pick up what we need," Marcus told Eleanor as he packed up his tools. "I can be back first thing in the morning to finish up. "There's no rush," Eleanor said. "I've lived with this fence for weeks now. I can manage another day or two." But as Marcus loaded his tools into his truck, he found himself eager to return, not just to finish the job, but to continue the conversation that had begun that morning. Eleanor Hartwell was turning out to be far more interesting than he'd expected, and he had the feeling there were depths to her story that she hadn't yet revealed. Emma was waiting by the school's front entrance when Marcus pulled up, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a piece of paper clutched in her hand. At 8 years old, she was all legs and energy, with her mother's dark eyes and Marcus's stubborn chin. She climbed into the truck with the easy confidence of a child who had never doubted that her father would be there when she needed him. "How was school?" Marcus asked as Emma buckled her seatbelt. "Good. Mrs. Patterson said I could do an extra credit report on whatever I want, so I'm going to write about why some houses have fences and others don't." Marcus smiled. Emma's curiosity about the world around her was endless, and she had a knack for finding deep questions hidden in everyday observations. "That sounds like an interesting topic. What got you thinking about fences?" "This morning when we were walking to school, I noticed that some of the big houses have really tall fences, like they're trying to keep people out. But some of the smaller houses have short fences that are more like saying hello to people walking by. I want to figure out what the difference means." As they drove home, Emma chattered about her day, her friends, and her latest theory about why dogs seem to prefer certain types of fences for barking through. Marcus listened with half his attention, while the other half thought about Eleanor's fence and what it represented. It wasn't designed to keep people out or make a statement about status. It was simply meant to define the boundary of her property in a way that was welcoming rather than forbidding. Their apartment was in a converted house on the south side of town, a neighborhood of working families and young couples just starting out. Marcus had chosen it because the rent was affordable and the schools were decent, but he'd hoped it would be temporary, a stepping stone to something better once he established himself in the local construction market. Now, 18 months later, it felt more permanent than he'd intended, a reminder of how difficult it was to get ahead when you were starting over with nothing. Emma settled at the kitchen table to work on homework while Marcus started dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti and jarred sauce that would stretch their grocery budget through the weekend. As he cooked, he found himself thinking about Eleanor's lunch, the care that had gone into preparation and presentation, the way a simple meal had been transformed into something special by the attention paid to details. "Dad," Emma said, looking up from her math worksheet, "are we poor?" The question caught Marcus off guard, though it wasn't the first time Emma had asked it. She was observant enough to notice that they shopped at discount stores, that they ate a lot of pasta and rice, that other kids in her class talked about vacations and activities that weren't part of their life. "We don't have a lot of extra money right now," Marcus said carefully. "But we have everything we need, and that's what matters. But if we had more money, would you be less worried all the time?" Marcus paused in his stirring, struck by his daughter's perceptiveness. He'd thought he'd been hiding his stress from her, but clearly Emma was more aware of their situation than he'd realized. "I'm not worried about the important things," Marcus said, turning to face her. "I'm not worried about whether I love you or whether you're safe or whether we'll figure out how to handle whatever comes next. I only worry about the little stuff, like making sure we have enough money for groceries and keeping the truck running. Those are grown-up worries, not your worries." Emma nodded solemnly, then returned to her math problems. But Marcus could see she wasn't entirely satisfied with his answer, and he made a mental note to be more careful about letting his financial stress show around her. After dinner, as Emma worked on her reading and Marcus cleaned up the kitchen, he thought about the money Eleanor had offered him and what it would mean for their situation. Even a modest payment for the fence work would help with their immediate expenses, and if the job led to referrals, it could be the beginning of the steady work he'd been seeking. But more than the money, the day had given him something he'd been missing: the sense that his skills were valued, that he could contribute something meaningful to someone else's life. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Marcus sat at his laptop researching fence repair techniques and calculating material costs. He wanted to do the job right, not just for Eleanor's sake, but for his own sense of professional pride. It had been too long since he'd had the opportunity to do quality work, to take the time and care necessary to create something that would last. He also found himself curious about Eleanor Hartwell and the property she'd lived on for 63 years. The house and yard suggested a comfortable middle-class life, but something about Eleanor herself hinted at depths he hadn't yet understood. Her test that morning had revealed a woman who was both careful and generous, someone who valued character over convenience, and who had learned to pay attention to the small gestures that revealed a person's true nature. The next morning, Marcus was back at Eleanor's house by 8 o'clock, his truck loaded with lumber, hardware, and concrete. Eleanor met him at the door with a fresh cup of coffee and a smile that suggested she'd been looking forward to his return. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "But I've been thinking about your daughter's fence project. If she'd like to interview someone about why people choose different types of fences, I'd be happy to share some stories about this old fence and the neighbors who've lived behind others over the years." Marcus was touched by Eleanor's offer and by the fact that she'd remembered Emma's school project. "She'd love that. Emma's always eager to talk to people about their experiences." "Good. Bring her by when you pick up your tools this afternoon. I'll make cookies." The promise of cookies and a genuine adult conversation would make Emma's day, Marcus knew. His daughter was precociously interested in other people's stories, and Eleanor seemed like someone who would have plenty of interesting tales to share. The morning's work went smoothly, with Marcus settling the fence posts in fresh concrete and beginning the process of cutting and fitting replacement boards. The work was methodical and satisfying, each repair bringing the fence closer to its original state. As he worked, Eleanor appeared periodically with refreshments or just to check on his progress, and their conversations continued to reveal new facets of both their personalities. Around mid-morning, as Marcus was sanding a salvaged board to prepare it for reuse, Eleanor asked about his military service. It wasn't a topic he discussed easily, but something about Eleanor's direct, non-judgmental manner made him comfortable sharing some of his experiences. "I enlisted right out of high school," Marcus said, pausing in his sanding. "Didn't have a lot of other options, and the Army seemed like a way to learn a trade and serve my country at the same time. Did you see combat?" "2 tours in Afghanistan. I was a combat engineer, which meant I spent a lot of time building things and taking apart things that other people had built to hurt us." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "That must have been difficult work." "It was. But it taught me a lot about construction, about working with my hands, about solving problems under pressure. When I got out, the transition to civilian carpentry felt pretty natural." "And you met your wife after you left the Army?" Marcus smiled, thinking about Sarah. "Actually, I met her while I was still in. She was a nurse at the VA hospital where I was getting treatment for a shoulder injury. She used to lecture me about not following my physical therapy instructions properly." "She sounds like a smart woman." "She was. Sarah had this way of seeing right through people's nonsense and getting them to do what they needed to do for their own good. She would have liked you, I think." Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "I would have liked to meet her. It takes a special kind of strength to love someone in a dangerous profession and support them in doing what they feel called to do." The observation was so perceptive that Marcus had to stop working for a moment. Eleanor had captured something essential about Sarah's character, the way she'd managed to worry about him without trying to change him, to support his choices even when those choices scared her. "She was worried about me, especially during the deployments," Marcus continued, his hands moving automatically as he spoke. "But she never tried to talk me out of re-enlisting or made me feel guilty about the risks. She just made sure I had something good waiting for me when I came home." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said, "Losing someone like that must have felt like losing your anchor." The metaphor was so accurate it took Marcus's breath away. That's exactly what it felt like. Sarah was my stability, my reason for planning beyond the next mission or the next paycheck. When she died, I felt like I was drifting without any way to navigate. And now? And now? Marcus considered the question as he resumed his sanding. Now I have Emma, and she needs me to be her anchor. Some days that feels like more responsibility than I can handle, but most days it gives me purpose. Children have a way of teaching us what we're capable of." Eleanor observed. "They need us to be stronger and more patient and more creative than we ever thought possible. Do you ever regret not having children?" It was a personal question, maybe too personal, but Eleanor didn't seem offended. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment, watching Marcus work with an expression that suggested she was weighing how much of her story to share. "I regret that Richard and I never got to experience that kind of love," she said finally. "But I don't regret the life we built together. We found other ways to nurture and care for people. Richard coached Little League for 20 years. And I volunteered at the library reading to children every Saturday morning until my arthritis got too bad. That sounds like you found ways to be parents to a lot of kids." "In small ways, yes. It wasn't the same as raising our own. But it was meaningful. And it taught us that family isn't always about blood relationships. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to care about you and the people you choose to care about in return." The conversation had grown deeper than Marcus had expected, touching on themes of loss, purpose, and the different ways people create meaning in their lives. As he worked on the fence, he found himself thinking about the connections between his story and Eleanor's, the way both of them had been forced to rebuild their lives after losing the future they'd planned. By lunchtime, Marcus had made significant progress on the fence repair. The posts were set and beginning to cure, and he'd fitted about half of the replacement boards. The structure was taking shape, looking more like a proper fence and less like a construction site. Eleanor had prepared another elaborate lunch, this time featuring homemade chicken salad sandwiches, fresh fruit, and iced tea with mint from her garden. As they ate, she asked about Marcus's plans for the future, his hopes for his carpentry business, and his dreams for Emma's education. "Have you thought about specializing in any particular type of carpentry work?" Eleanor asked. "Kitchen remodels, custom furniture, historic restoration?" "I've done a little bit of everything," Marcus replied. "In the Army, you learn to be adaptable, to work with whatever materials and tools are available. But if I had my choice, I think I'd like to focus on restoration work. There's something satisfying about bringing old craftsmanship back to life, preserving the work that previous generations of builders put into creating something beautiful." Eleanor's eyes lit up with interest. "That's a specialized skill. Not many people know how to work with old construction techniques." "It's becoming a lost art," Marcus agreed. "Modern construction is all about efficiency and cost-cutting. But the old craftsmen took pride in details that don't add structural value but make a building beautiful. Hand-carved moldings, mortise and tenon joinery, hardware that was made to last for generations." "Millbrook has a lot of historic properties that could use that kind of attention," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "The Victorian houses on Elm Street, some of the old farm buildings scattered around the county. Most of the contractors around here don't have the patience or skill for that kind of work. The challenge is finding clients who are willing to pay for quality restoration instead of just covering up problems with modern materials," Marcus said. "It costs more up front, but it lasts longer and maintains the character of the original building. The right clients are out there," Eleanor said with conviction. "People who value craftsmanship and understand that some things are worth doing properly, even if it takes more time and money." After lunch, Marcus returned to the fence with renewed energy. The afternoon work focused on the detailed carpentry, fitting each board precisely and ensuring that the spacing and alignment matched the original construction. It was meticulous work that required patience and attention to detail, but it was also the kind of craftsmanship that Marcus found most satisfying. Eleanor spent much of the afternoon working in her garden, preparing the flower beds for winter and harvesting the last of the season's vegetables. Marcus found himself glancing over at her periodically, admiring the efficient way she moved through the tasks and the obvious care she took with each plant. There was something soothing about working in parallel, each focused on their own project but sharing the same space and the same appreciation for work done well. Around 3 o'clock, Marcus realized he needed to finish up for the day to pick up Emma from school. The fence was nearly complete, needing only a final coat of paint and some minor adjustments to the gate hardware. "I should be able to finish everything tomorrow morning," Marcus told Eleanor as he cleaned his tools.
"The fence is structurally sound now, and the cosmetic work won't take long."
"It looks wonderful already," Eleanor said, studying his work with obvious satisfaction. "Much better than I expected when we started." "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it right," Marcus said. "It's been a long time since I've had a project where I could take the time to do quality work instead of just getting by." Eleanor smiled.
"Quality work deserves quality time. I'm in no hurry, and I'd rather have it done properly than quickly." As Marcus loaded his tools into the truck, Eleanor reminded him about her offer to talk with Emma about fences and their purposes. "Bring her by when you come tomorrow. I'll have cookies ready, and I've been thinking about some stories that might interest her."
The drive to Emma's school gave Marcus time to reflect on the day and the surprising depth of his conversations with Eleanor. She was turning out to be far more than the lonely, elderly widow he'd initially assumed her to be. Her questions were thoughtful, her observations perceptive, and her interest in his work and his story seemed genuine rather than polite. Emma was full of energy when Marcus picked her up, excited about a science project her class was starting and eager to share her progress on the fence research she'd been conducting during recess and lunch.
"I talked to Mrs. Patterson about my fence project,"
Emma announced as she buckled her seatbelt.
"She said I should interview at least 3 people about why they chose their fences, and she gave me some questions to ask about how fences affect neighborhoods." "That sounds like good research methodology," Marcus said, impressed by his daughter's systematic approach. "I actually have someone who'd be perfect for you to interview. The lady whose fence I'm fixing offered to talk with you about her experiences."
Emma's eyes lit up. "Really? What kind of fence does she have?"
"A white picket fence, the traditional kind. And she's lived behind it for over 60 years, so she has a lot of stories about how the neighborhood has changed and how different fences serve different purposes. Can we?"
"You'll see her today?"
"Tomorrow, when I finish the repair work. She's making cookies specially for your visit."
The promise of cookies and a genuine interview subject made Emma bounce with excitement in her seat. She spent the rest of the drive home planning her questions and speculating about what kinds of stories Eleanor might have to share. That evening, as Marcus helped Emma with her homework and listened to her read aloud from her library book, he found himself looking forward to the next day in a way he hadn't experienced in months. Not just because the fence job was going well and would provide some much-needed income, but because he'd found something he'd been missing without realizing it. Meaningful conversation with another adult who seemed to understand and appreciate the things that mattered to him. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Eleanor's house to find her already awake and working in her kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and baking cookies drifted from the open windows, and Eleanor greeted him with a smile that suggested she'd been looking forward to his return.
"Perfect timing,"
she said, opening the door before he could knock.
"The cookies just came out of the oven, and I have fresh coffee ready."
"You're going to spoil me,"
Marcus said, accepting the offered mug gratefully.
"I'll get used to this kind of treatment and forget how to take care of myself." "There's nothing wrong with being taken care of occasionally," Eleanor replied.
"Everyone needs someone to fuss over them once in a while."
The morning's work focused on the finishing touches, sanding the gate until it hung properly, applying primer to the new boards and making final adjustments to ensure everything was aligned correctly. It was detailed work that required patience, but Marcus found himself enjoying the precision required to make everything perfect. Eleanor appeared periodically to check on his progress, and their conversations continued to reveal new dimensions of both their personalities. She told him about the various neighbors who had lived in the surrounding houses over the years, the changes she'd witnessed in the neighborhood, and the small dramas and celebrations that had played out behind various fences over time. The decades. The Hendersons, who lived next door for 30 years, had a chain-link fence because they kept German shepherds, Eleanor recalled. Those dogs were beautiful but intimidating. And the fence made it clear that their yard was off-limits to casual visitors. But the Hendersons themselves were the kindest people you could ask for. They just needed a barrier that matched their dogs' personalities. And the fence on the other side? That's a newer family, the Johnsons. They put up a privacy fence when they moved in 5 years ago. 6 feet tall, solid boards, no way to see into their yard. I thought it seemed unfriendly at first. But then I realized they have teenage children and need space to be teenagers without feeling like the neighbors are watching their every move. Marcus found Eleanor's observations about fences and their social implications fascinating. She'd clearly spent years thinking about the psychology of boundaries, the ways people used physical barriers to communicate their needs and preferences to the wider community. "What does your fence say?" Marcus asked as he applied primer to a replacement board. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I think it says that I want to be part of a neighborhood without giving up my privacy. It's low enough that people can see my garden and wave hello, but high enough to create a clear boundary around my personal space. It's meant to be welcoming rather than intimidating." "That matches my impression of you," Marcus said. "Friendly but not intrusive, interested in other people but respectful of boundaries." Eleanor smiled. "That's exactly the impression I hope to give. I've learned over the years that the best relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine interest rather than forced intimacy." As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself working more slowly than necessary, not because the job was difficult, but because he was reluctant for it to end. The fence repair had become more than just a construction project. It had become an opportunity to connect with someone who appreciated quality work and understood the satisfaction that came from doing things properly. Around 11 o'clock, Eleanor brought out a fresh batch of cookies and announced that she had something she wanted to show Marcus. She led him around to the back of her house, where he was surprised to discover that her 5-acre property extended much further than he'd realized. Behind the house, a large meadow stretched toward a line of trees, with what looked like the remnants of old farm buildings scattered across the landscape. "This is what Richard and I were going to turn into a working farm," Eleanor explained, gesturing toward the open space. "We had plans for vegetable gardens, fruit trees, maybe some livestock. Life took us in other directions, but I've always loved having the space." Marcus studied the property with the eye of someone who understood both construction and land use. Even in its current state, with the fields lying fallow and the outbuildings in need of repair, he could see the potential Eleanor and her husband had envisioned. The land was gently rolling with good drainage, the soil looked rich and well-suited for agriculture, and the existing structures, though weathered, showed signs of solid construction. "It's beautiful," Marcus said sincerely. "Even without active farming, having this much open space must be wonderful." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "But it's also more than I can manage alone. The buildings need work, the fields should be mowed regularly, and I worry about what will happen to it all when I'm gone." There was something wistful in Eleanor's voice that made Marcus look at her more carefully. She was standing in the middle of her property, surrounded by the dreams she and her husband had never quite realized, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked every one of her 70-plus years. "Do you have family who might want to keep the property?" Marcus asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. "Richard and I were both only children, and as I mentioned, we never had children of our own. There are some distant cousins somewhere, but nobody I've stayed in touch with. This place has been my whole world for 63 years, and someday it will belong to strangers who probably won't understand what it meant to us." The sadness in her voice was so profound that Marcus felt an unexpected urge to comfort her, to find some way to reassure her that her life's work had meaning beyond her own experience of it. But before he could find the right words, Eleanor seemed to shake off her melancholy mood and turned back toward the house. "Come on," she said with forced brightness. "Let's get you back to work on that fence. I want it to be perfect when your daughter sees it this afternoon." They returned to the front yard, where Marcus spent the rest of the morning applying the final coats of paint and making minute adjustments to ensure everything was aligned properly. The work was meditative, requiring just enough concentration to keep his hands busy while allowing his mind to process the morning's conversation and the glimpse Eleanor had given him into her private concerns about the future. By early afternoon, the fence was complete. It looked exactly as it should have looked originally, with clean white paint, properly aligned boards, and hardware that would last for decades. The gate swung smoothly on its new hinges, and the overall effect was one of welcoming stability that perfectly complemented the neat house and well-maintained garden. Eleanor walked the entire perimeter of the fence, examining Marcus's work with the careful attention of someone who understood quality craftsmanship. Her approval was evident in her expression long before she spoke. "It's perfect," she said finally. "Better than it ever looked, even when it was new." "You've done beautiful work, Marcus." The genuine admiration in her voice meant more to Marcus than any payment could have. It had been too long since someone had looked at his work and seen not just function but artistry, not just a completed task but evidence of skill and care. "Thank you," Marcus said simply. "It was a pleasure to work on. Good materials, a clear vision of what the finished product should look like, and time to do it properly. That's all any craftsman really needs." Eleanor smiled and disappeared into the house, returning a few minutes later with an envelope and a plate of the cookies she'd promised to have ready for Emma's visit. "Your payment," Eleanor said, offering Marcus the envelope. "And I added a little extra because the work exceeded my expectations." Marcus opened the envelope and was surprised to find significantly more money than they'd discussed. Not just enough to cover materials and a fair wage for his labor, but enough to make a real difference in his and Emma's financial situation. "This is too much," Marcus protested. "We agreed on a price, and this is way more than the work was worth." "The work was worth whatever it's worth to me to have it done properly by someone I trust," Eleanor replied firmly. "And it's worth a lot to me to know that there are still people in the world who will help a neighbor without calculating the personal benefit first." Marcus wanted to argue, but something in Eleanor's expression told him that accepting her generosity gracefully was more important than adhering to strict mathematical fairness. She had her own reasons for paying him, well, reasons that probably had as much to do with her own satisfaction as with the value of his labor. "Thank you," Marcus said. "This means more than you know." "I think I have some idea," Eleanor replied. "Now, when can I expect to meet this daughter of yours? I have cookies cooling and stories ready to share." Marcus checked his watch and realized it was almost time to pick up Emma from school. "I can bring her by in about an hour, if that works for you." "Perfect. That will give me time to think through which stories would be most useful for her project." As Marcus loaded his tools into the truck, he found himself reluctant to leave. The past 3 days had been the most satisfying work experience he'd had since moving to Millbrook. Not just because of the payment, but because of the human connection that had developed alongside the professional relationship. Eleanor had treated him as a craftsman rather than just hired help, had been interested in his techniques and his opinions, and had made him feel valued in ways that went beyond the monetary transaction. "Eleanor," Marcus said as he prepared to drive away, Thank you for more than just the work. These conversations have meant a lot to me."
Eleanor's smile was warm and genuine. "They've meant a lot to me too, Marcus."
It's been wonderful to have someone to talk with who understands the satisfaction of work done well.
The drive to Emma's school gave Marcus time to process the emotions stirring in his chest. The fence job was ending.
But something told him that his relationship with Eleanor Hartwell was just beginning. She had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death, a sense that meaningful connections were still possible.
That there were people in the world who could appreciate both his skills and his character. Emma was waiting by the school entrance with her backpack and a folder full of papers for her fence project. She climbed into the truck with her ska.
Usual energy. Chattering about her day and asking eager questions about the interview she was about to conduct. "Did you tell her about my questions?" Emma asked as they drove toward Eleanor's house. "Does she know I'm writing about different types of fences and what they mean?" "She knows, and she's been thinking about stories that might help with your research," Marcus assured her. "She's lived in the same house for over 60 years, so she's seen a lot of different fences and neighbors over the years." "What's she like?" Marcus considered how to describe Eleanor to his daughter. "She's smart and thoughtful, and she pays attention to details that other people might miss. She asks good questions and gives thoughtful answers. I think you two will get along well."
When they arrived at Eleanor's house, Emma immediately noticed the completed fence repair. She walked along the perimeter, examining Marcus's work with the same careful attention Eleanor had shown, running her small hands along the smooth paint and testing the gate to see how easily it swung.
"This is really good work, Dad," Emma announced with the serious tone she used when offering considered opinions. "It looks like it was always supposed to look exactly like this." "That's the best compliment a craftsman can receive," Marcus said, pleased by his daughter's observation. "The goal is always to make repairs look like they were part of the original plan."
Eleanor appeared on her porch, wearing a fresh blouse and carrying a plate of cookies that were still warm from the oven. Her face lit up when she saw Emma.
And Marcus realized she'd been looking forward to this meeting as much as his daughter had. "You must be Emma," Eleanor said, descending the porch steps with a smile. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell, and I've been very excited to meet you and hear about your fence project."
Emma stepped forward with the confident politeness Marcus had taught her for meeting adults. "Thank you for agreeing to talk with me, Mrs. Hartwell."
"My dad says you know a lot about fences and neighborhoods."
"I know something about both," Eleanor replied. "But mostly I know stories, and I think stories might be useful for your research."
"Would you like to come inside for cookies and conversation?"
Eleanor's kitchen was warm and welcoming, with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the garden and the newly repaired fence. She'd set the table with 3 place settings, complete with cloth napkins and small glasses of milk for Emma and coffee for the adults. The cookies were chocolate chip, still warm from the oven, and Emma's eyes widened with appreciation at the first bite. "These are really good," Emma said with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "Did you make them just for me?"
"I did," Eleanor replied. "I enjoy baking, but it's more fun when you have someone special to share the results with."
Emma pulled out a small notebook and a pencil, her expression growing serious as she prepared to conduct her interview.
"Mrs. Hartwell, can you tell me why you chose a white picket fence instead of a different kind?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness she'd shown throughout her conversations with Marcus.
"That's an excellent question, Emma. When my husband and I moved to this house 63 years ago,
we wanted a fence that would be friendly to our neighbors while still marking the boundaries of our property. A white picket fence says welcome rather than keep out, but it still makes it clear where our yard ends and the street Sean Day begins."
Emma wrote carefully in her notebook, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on capturing Eleanor's words accurately.
"Have you ever thought about changing it to a different kind of fence?" "Never," Eleanor said without hesitation. "This fence reflects who we are as people. We want to be good neighbors, but we also value our privacy. We want people to feel welcome in our space, but we want them to ask permission before entering. A picket fence accomplishes all of those goals. What about your neighbors? Do they have different kinds of fences? Eleanor smiled, clearly delighted by Emma's systematic approach to her research. They do, and each fence tells you something about the people who chose it. Would you like to take a walk around the neighborhood so I can show you some examples? Emma's excitement was palpable. The walking tour with a knowledgeable guide was exactly the kind of primary research that would make her project special. Marcus found himself equally intrigued by Eleanor's offer, curious to see the neighborhood through her eyes and to understand how she'd developed her theories about fences and their social meanings. They spent the next hour walking through Eleanor's neighborhood, with Eleanor pointing out different styles of fencing and explaining what she'd observed about the families who lived behind them. The Victorian house with the ornate iron fence belonged to a couple who collected antiques and wanted their barrier to reflect their appreciation for craftsmanship. The ranch house with no fence at all belonged to a family with young children who wanted their yard to feel integrated with the community space. Emma asked thoughtful questions and took careful notes, clearly fascinated by Eleanor's insights into the psychology of boundaries and the ways people used physical barriers to communicate their values and preferences. Marcus found himself learning as much as his daughter, gaining new appreciation for the complexity of suburban social dynamics and the subtle messages embedded in seemingly simple choices. When they returned to Eleanor's house, Emma had filled several pages of her notebook and was buzzing with ideas for her report. Eleanor invited them back into the kitchen for more cookies and milk, and the conversation shifted to Emma's school, her interests, and her thoughts about the research she'd been conducting. "What's the most interesting thing you've learned so far?" Eleanor asked as Emma finished her second cookie. Emma considered the question seriously. "I think the most interesting thing is that fences aren't really about keeping people out or in. They're about communication. They're how people tell their neighbors what kind of relationship they want to have." Eleanor and Marcus exchanged glances, both impressed by Emma's insight. The 8-year-old had grasped something sophisticated about human nature and social dynamics, something that many adults never fully understood. "That's a very wise observation," Eleanor said. "You're going to write an excellent report." As the afternoon wound down, Marcus realized it was time to head home to start dinner and help Emma with her other homework. The fence job was complete, the payment was in his pocket, and Emma had gathered excellent material for her school project. By all practical measures, their business with Eleanor Hartwell was finished. But as they prepared to leave, Marcus found himself hoping this wouldn't be their last visit. Emma had clearly formed a connection with Eleanor, and Eleanor seemed to have enjoyed the opportunity to share her knowledge and stories with an eager young audience. More than that, Marcus had found in Eleanor something he hadn't realized he was missing, an adult friend who appreciated both his work and his character, someone whose conversation challenged and enriched his thinking. "Mrs. Hartwell," Emma said as they gathered her research materials, "would it be okay if I came back to visit you sometime, even after my report is finished?" Eleanor's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I would love that, Emma. And you're welcome to bring your father along if he's not too busy with other projects." "I'm never too busy for good company," Marcus said, meaning it completely. "Thank you for everything, Eleanor. The work, the conversations, the kindness to Emma. It's meant more than you know." Eleanor walked them to the gate, which now swung smoothly on its new hinges and latched securely with hardware that would last for decades. As Marcus and Emma climbed into the truck, Eleanor stood beside her perfectly repaired fence, waving goodbye with a smile that suggested she was already looking forward to their next visit. The drive home was filled with Emma's excited chatter about her research discoveries and her plans for organizing her report. She'd clearly been impressed by Eleanor's knowledge and insight, and Marcus could see that his daughter had found in the elderly woman a kindred spirit who shared her curiosity about human behavior and social dynamics.
"Dad," Emma said as they pulled into their apartment complex, "Mrs. Hartwell is really smart, isn't she?"
"She is," Marcus agreed.
"She's had a lot of years to observe people and think about what she's learned. And she's lonely." The observation caught Marcus off guard with its perceptiveness. "What makes you say that?" "The way she lit up when we came to visit, and the way she kept asking questions about us, like she was storing up the information for later. And her house is really neat and nice, but it feels like it's waiting for more people to be in it." Marcus was struck by his daughter's insight. Emma had noticed something he'd sensed but hadn't quite articulated. That despite Eleanor's self-sufficiency and apparent contentment, there was a quality of waiting about her, as if she was maintaining her home and her routines in hopes that someone would eventually share them with her. "You might be right about that," Marcus said. "What do you think we should do about it?" Emma considered this seriously. "I think we should visit her again soon. Not for my report or for work, just a visit. Because everybody needs people to care about them." That evening, as Marcus helped Emma organize her research notes and start outlining her report, he found his thoughts returning again and again to Eleanor and the conversation they'd had about the property behind her house. The sadness in her voice when she'd talked about not having family to inherit the land had stayed with him, along with her concern about what would happen to the place that had been her whole world for over 60 years. Marcus understood something about losing the future you'd planned for. His dreams with Sarah hadn't included single parenthood or financial struggle or starting over in a new town with no connections. But he'd learned that sometimes the life you build from the pieces of broken dreams could be as meaningful as the original plan, just different from what you'd expected. Maybe Eleanor's story wasn't finished yet. Maybe there were still chapters to be written, connections to be made, purposes to be discovered. And maybe, Marcus thought as he tucked Emma into bed and listened to her excited plans for her fence report, he and Emma could be part of whatever came next in Eleanor Hartwell's story. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Marcus used Eleanor's payment and the referrals it generated to secure several more carpentry jobs around Millbrook. Word spread quickly in the small town about the quality of his work on Eleanor's fence, and soon he had more requests than he could handle. The Victorian house down the street needed custom window trim. A local business wanted built-in shelving, and the Historical Society contacted him about restoration work on the old mill building. For the first time since Sarah's death, Marcus felt like he was building something sustainable, a reputation and a client base that could provide steady income for his family. Emma's routine stabilized as well. She finished her fence report, which earned an A+ in praise from her teacher for its original insights into neighborhood sociology. More importantly, she began talking about Millbrook as home rather than just the place they happened to be living. But the most significant change was the friendship that developed between Marcus, Emma, and Eleanor. What had started as a business transaction had evolved into something much richer: regular visits, shared meals, and the kind of intergenerational connection that enriched all their lives. Emma visited Eleanor at least twice a week, sometimes to help with small tasks around the house, but more often just to talk. Eleanor had become a combination of grandmother, mentor, and friend to the 8-year-old, someone who listened to her ideas with genuine interest and shared stories that broadened Emma's understanding of the world. Marcus found himself stopping by Eleanor's house, even when he didn't have specific work to do, drawn by the quality of conversation and the sense of peace he felt in her presence. Eleanor had become his sounding board for business decisions, his source of local knowledge about potential clients, and his friend in the truest sense of the word. One evening in late January, as Marcus and Emma were finishing dinner in their small apartment, the phone rang. Marcus answered to find Eleanor's voice, but something was wrong. She sounded shaky, uncertain in a way he'd never heard before. "Marcus," Eleanor said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wonder if you could come over. I've had some kind of episode and I'm not sure what to do." Marcus was already reaching for his coat before Eleanor finished speaking. "What kind of episode? Do you need me to call an ambulance? No ambulance. I just got dizzy and fell in the kitchen. I'm fine now, but I'm a little shaken up, and I'd feel better if someone could take a look at me. We'll be right there, Marcus said, gesturing for Emma to get her coat. Just sit down and don't try to clean up or do anything else until we get there. The drive to Eleanor's house took only 5 minutes, but it felt much longer. Marcus found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, worried about what they would find when they arrived. Eleanor had become such a constant, stable presence in their lives that the idea of her being vulnerable or hurt was difficult to process. They found Eleanor sitting at her kitchen table, looking pale but alert. There was a broken coffee mug on the floor and a small cut on her forehead, but she was clearly conscious and coherent. "I'm sorry to worry you," Eleanor said as Marcus and Emma rushed into the kitchen. "I was reaching for something on a high shelf, got dizzy, and the next thing I knew I was on the floor with broken pottery around me." Marcus knelt beside Eleanor's chair, examining the cut on her forehead with the first aid knowledge he'd learned in the Army. "This doesn't look too serious, but head injuries can be tricky. When did this happen?" "About an hour ago. I cleaned up most of the mess and tried to decide whether to call someone. I don't like to be a bother." "You're never a bother," Emma said firmly, taking Eleanor's hand. "That's what friends do. They help each other when something is wrong." Marcus cleaned Eleanor's cut with antiseptic from her medicine cabinet and applied a small bandage, but he was more concerned about the dizziness that had caused the fall. Eleanor was in her 70s, and sudden dizzy spells could indicate serious medical problems. "Have you been having dizzy spells before this?" Marcus asked gently. Eleanor hesitated, and Marcus could see her weighing how much to reveal. "A few times in the past month, usually when I stand up too quickly or try to reach something above my head. I assumed it was just part of getting older." "It might be, but it's worth having a doctor check you out. Dizziness can be caused by blood pressure issues, inner ear problems, medication interactions, all sorts of things that are treatable if you catch them early. I hate going to doctors," Eleanor said with a sigh. "They always want to run expensive tests and prescribe medications that cause more problems than they solve." Marcus understood Eleanor's reluctance. Medical expenses had been a major factor in his own financial struggles, and he knew that many elderly people on fixed incomes had to choose between health care and other necessities. But he also knew that ignoring potentially serious symptoms was dangerous. "What if I drove you to the clinic tomorrow?" Marcus offered. "Just for a basic checkup, nothing major. If the doctor thinks you need more extensive testing, we can discuss it then." Eleanor looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested she was touched by his concern, but still uncertain about accepting help. "I don't want to impose on your work schedule." "You're not imposing. Your family." The words slipped out before Marcus realized he was going to say them, but once they were spoken, he realized they were true. Eleanor had become family in all the ways that mattered. Someone he cared about, someone he worried about, someone whose well-being was connected to his own sense of security and happiness. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed Emma's hand tighter. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Both of you. I forgot what it felt like to have people who cared about me." They spent the rest of the evening at Eleanor's house, with Marcus checking on her periodically while Emma entertained her with stories from school and updates on her latest research projects. By the time they were ready to leave, Eleanor's color had returned to normal, and she seemed steadier on her feet, but Marcus was still concerned about leaving her alone. "Are you sure you'll be all right tonight?" Marcus asked as they prepared to go home. "And then I could sleep on your couch if you'd feel safer having someone here." Eleanor smiled at the offer but shook her head. "I'll be fine, but thank you for offering and thank you for coming over when I called. It means more than you know to have people I can count on." The next morning, Marcus called his scheduled client and rescheduled the job.
then drove Eleanor to the local medical clinic for a checkup. The doctor was thorough and kind, running basic tests for blood pressure, blood sugar, and inner ear problems. The results showed that Eleanor's blood pressure medication needed adjustment, a simple fix that should resolve the dizziness issues. As they left the clinic with a new prescription and instructions for monitoring Eleanor's symptoms, Marcus felt a sense of relief that surprised him with its intensity. He'd been more worried about Eleanor's health than he'd realized, and knowing that her problem was treatable made him understand how important she'd become to his sense of family and home.